What if God made you a promise and then made you wait so long for it that almost everyone who heard it died before it ever came true? This is not just a story about ancient Israel. It is a story about human fear and divine faithfulness. After centuries of slavery in Egypt, the Israelites were finally free. They had watched the Red Sea split open before their eyes. They had walked through walls of water on dry ground. They had seen Pharaoh's army swallowed by the sea behind them. They ate bread that fell from the sky. They drank water that flowed from a rock. They stood trembling at Mount Sinai as fire and thunder announced the presence of God. No generation in history had seen miracles like these, and yet, standing at the edge of destiny, they hesitated. Before them lay Canaan, the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob hundreds of years earlier. A land described as flowing with milk and honey, a land meant to be their inheritance. God spoke to Moses and gave a command: send 12 men to explore the land. One man from each tribe, leaders, respected voices, not to decide whether they should enter. God had already made that decision, but to see what awaited them. For 40 days the spies walked through the land. They saw fertile fields and thriving cities. They cut down a single cluster of grapes so large that 2 men had to carry it on a pole between them. The land was exactly as God promised, but it was also intimidating. The cities were fortified, the people were strong, and there were giants, the Anakim, warriors whose reputation alone inspired terror. When the spies returned, the entire camp gathered. Millions of people waited for the report that would shape their future. 10 of the spies spoke first. Their words sounded reasonable, logical, careful. Yes, the land flows with milk and honey, they said, but the people are stronger than we are. Their cities are large and fortified. We even saw giants there. Then came the sentence that changed everything. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. Fear spread through the camp like a disease. Cries filled the night. Families wept. Voices rose in anger. Why did God bring us here to die? Let's choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Slavery suddenly felt safer than faith, but 2 men refused to be silent. Joshua and Caleb stepped forward. They tore their clothes in grief. The land we explored is exceedingly good, they cried. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into it. Do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land. Their protection is gone. The Lord is with us. The response was immediate. The crowd didn't cheer. They picked up stones. That night, God himself appeared in the camp. Not with patience, not with another miracle, but with judgment. How long will this people despise me? God said. How long will they refuse to believe, despite all the signs I have shown them? Then the verdict was spoken. Every person 20 years and older who chose fear over faith would die in the wilderness. They would wander for 40 years, 1 year for every day the land was explored. They would see the promise, but never step into it, except for 2, Joshua and Caleb. 2 men who trusted God when an entire nation chose fear instead. And from that moment on, the promise did not disappear, but the generation meant to receive it did. Morning came, but peace did not. The sun rose over a camp filled with regret, confusion, and dread. The people who had cried all night now spoke with different voices. We have sinned, they said. We will go up and take the land the Lord promised. But something had changed. God had already spoken. Moses stood before them and warned them clearly. Do not go, he said. The Lord is not with you. You will be defeated. This was the tragedy of Israel's choice. They had refused to go when God said go. Now they wanted to go when God said stop. Faith delayed had turned into presumption. Still they went, without the ark, without Moses, without the presence of God. The Amalekites and Canaanites descended on them like a storm. Israel fled in panic, chased through the hills, beaten and scattered. It was a defeat not caused by weak soldiers, but by disobedient hearts, and so began the wandering. What should have been an 11-day journey became 40 years in the wilderness. Days blurred into years, years into funerals. One by one, the generation that left Egypt began to disappear. The men who had watched the Red Sea split, the women who had danced with tambourines, the parents who had sworn never to return to slavery. They all died in the desert. Every grave was a reminder. Fear has consequences. Yet in the middle of judgment, God's faithfulness remained. Their clothes did not wear out. Their sandals did not fall apart. Manna still fell each morning. God was not absent, but the promise was postponed. And among the millions walking in circles, two men carried a memory that refused to die: Joshua and Caleb. For them, every sunrise was a test of endurance. Every burial was a reminder of what fear had stolen. Every step in the sand whispered the same question: will God still keep his word? Caleb did not grow bitter. Scripture says he had a different spirit. While others complained, he remembered. While others cursed the desert, he held on to the promise. Joshua walked closely with Moses. He stayed at the tent of meeting after others left. He learned that leadership was not about strength, but about staying near the presence of God. Then came another blow. Miriam died. Aaron followed not long after, stripped of his priestly garments and buried on Mount Hor. The old generation was nearly gone. Finally, even Moses, the man who spoke to God face to face, was told he would not enter the land. At Meribah, Moses struck the rock in anger instead of honoring God before the people. The consequence was severe. He could see the promise, but not step into it. Before his death, Moses laid hands on Joshua. In front of the entire nation, God confirmed the transition. "Be strong and courageous," the Lord said. "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you." Leadership changed hands. A new chapter began. Then the final days of wandering ended. The Jordan River stood before them, flooded and impossible. Behind them lay 40 years of graves and regret. This time, God moved first. As the priests stepped into the water, the river stopped flowing. Israel crossed on dry ground. 12 stones were lifted from the riverbed, a memorial for future generations. And just like that, the wilderness ended. But the promise was not yet complete. Walls still stood, enemies still waited, and somewhere in the land lived the giants that 10 spies once said could never be defeated. Joshua prepared the people for war, but far from the noise of the camp, an old man watched the horizon. Caleb, 85 years old, still standing, still believing. The mountain he remembered had not changed, and soon he would ask for it. The wilderness was finally behind them. After 40 years of wandering, Israel stood on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. Ahead lay the land they had heard about their entire lives. Behind them lay graves, regrets, and a generation that never made it. The Jordan was at flood stage, wide, violent, unstoppable. There were no boats, no bridges, no retreat. Then God spoke again. "Tell the priests to step into the water." It made no sense. The river did not part first. The command came before the miracle. Joshua obeyed. As the priests carrying the ark stepped forward, their feet touched the edge of the river, and only then did the water stop. Upstream, the river piled up into a wall. Downstream, it drained away. Israel crossed on dry ground. 12 men carried 12 stones from the riverbed and set them up as a memorial. "When your children ask, 'What do these stones mean?' Joshua said, 'Tell them the Lord stopped the waters of the Jordan.'" This was not just a crossing, it was a declaration. The God who opened the Red Sea was still alive, still powerful, still faithful. Word spread quickly through the land. The kings of Canaan heard what had happened, and their hearts melted with fear. Israel's first enemy stood directly ahead. Jericho, a city unlike any they had seen. Massive walls, fortified gates, impenetrable defenses. Human strategy would have demanded siege towers, weapons, and time. But God gave a different plan, a plan that sounded absurd. "For 6 days," God said, "march around the city once each day. Say nothing. On the 7th day, march around it 7 times. Then blow the trumpets and shout. No ladders, no battering rams, no attack. Just obedience." The people marched. Day 1, silence. Day 2, silence. Day 3, silence. The soldiers of Jericho mocked from the walls. Confidence filled their city. What kind of army fights without fighting? On the 7th day, Israel marched 7 times. The priests blew the trumpets. Joshua raised his voice. "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." The sound echoed across the plain. And then the impossible happened. The walls collapsed, not cracked, not weakened. They fell flat. Israel rushed forward straight into the city. Jericho fell without a single sword striking its walls. Only one household was spared, Rahab, a woman who had hidden the spies years earlier. A woman who believed Israel's God was greater than her city's gods. Faith saved her and her family. Victory followed. But confidence can be dangerous. The next city was Ai, small, insignificant. Joshua sent only a few men. They were defeated. 36 Israelites died. Panic returned. Joshua fell face down before God. "Why?" he cried. God answered with clarity. "Israel has sinned." A man named Achan had taken forbidden items from Jericho. Hidden sin had weakened the entire nation. Once the sin was dealt with, Israel returned to Ai. This time they won. The lesson was clear. God's power does not excuse disobedience. As Israel moved deeper into the land, the kings of Canaan formed alliances. They gathered armies to stop the invasion. Battle after battle followed. Then came a moment that would be remembered forever. Joshua stood before his enemies and prayed a dangerous prayer. "Sun, stand still over Gibeon. Moon, stop over the valley of Agalon." And the heavens obeyed. The sun did not rush to set. The day stretched longer than any other. Israel fought until victory was complete, not by their strength alone, but because God fought for them. The land began to change hands. Cities fell. Kings were defeated. And quietly, steadily, the promise moved closer to fulfillment. Yet one challenge remained, a place everyone remembered, a mountain once feared, a city once avoided, Hebron, the home of the giants. And somewhere nearby, an old warrior waited for the moment he had believed in for 45 years. The major battles were over. The land of Canaan, once whispered about in fear, was now largely under Israel's control. Kings had fallen. Cities lay silent. The impossible had become history. Joshua gathered the leaders to divide the land among the tribes. Boundaries were measured. Inheritances were assigned. A new nation was taking shape. And then from among the crowd, an old man stepped forward, Caleb. Time had carved lines into his face, but it had not weakened his eyes. His posture was straight, his voice steady. He stood before Joshua, the same Joshua who had once stood beside him against an entire generation of fear. Caleb spoke slowly, deliberately. "You know what the Lord said to Moses concerning you and me at Kadesh Barnea." The memory cut deep. 45 years earlier, they had stood before the same land, the same mountains, the same giants. "While others melted with fear," Caleb continued, "I followed the Lord wholeheartedly." He reminded Joshua of the promise. That day Moses had sworn an oath. "The land your feet have walked on will be your inheritance." Then Caleb said something astonishing. "I am 85 years old today, yet I am as strong now as I was then. I am still ready for battle." The leaders listened in silence. Caleb pointed toward the hills. "Now give me this mountain." That mountain was Hebron. Everyone remembered Hebron. It was the place that terrified the 10 spies. The home of the Anakim, giants whose names were spoken in whispers. Even now, long after other cities had fallen, Hebron remained unconquered. Caleb did not ask for a quiet valley. He did not ask for land already secured. He asked for the very place that once symbolized impossibility. "The Lord will be with me," he said, "and I will drive them out." Joshua did not hesitate. He blessed Caleb and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. And Caleb went, an old man climbing a mountain that fear had once declared untouchable. The giants still lived there. Their cities were still fortified. But something had changed. The fear that once paralyzed a nation no longer lived in Caleb's heart. One by one, the Anakim fell. The strongholds collapsed. Hebron was conquered. The mountain that once whispered fear now echoed with victory. And Scripture makes a simple statement. Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb because he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. Not because he was young, not because he was powerful, but because he believed. As the land settled into peace, Joshua gathered the entire nation one final time. He was old now. His journey was nearly complete. He reminded them of everything God had done, how he brought them out of Egypt, how he sustained them in the wilderness, how he fought for them in the land. Then Joshua spoke words that would echo through generations. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, the gods beyond the river, the gods of the Amorites, or the Lord who kept his promises. Joshua's voice did not tremble. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The people answered with confidence, we too will serve the Lord. A covenant was renewed. Stones were set as witnesses. Joshua lived to see peace in the land. He died at 110 years old and was buried in the inheritance he received. Scripture ends his story with a powerful line. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him. The promise had been fulfilled. But the story leaves us with a question. An entire generation saw miracles and still died in the wilderness. Two men waited decades and stepped into everything God promised. The difference was never strength, it was never opportunity, it was belief. Because God's promises do not expire, but only those who trust him live long enough to walk into them. Peace finally settled over the land, not the fragile silence after battle, but the deep stillness of fulfillment. For the first time in decades, Israel was not marching, not fleeing, not fighting. They were living. Fields were planted, homes were built. Children grew up hearing stories not of slavery, but of victory. The land that once existed only in promises now existed under their feet. Scripture pauses here and gives us a summary statement so powerful it cannot be rushed. The Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors. Every word matters. Not some of the land, not most of it, all of it. Every boundary promised to Abraham, every oath spoken to Isaac, every assurance given to Jacob. Fulfilled. And then comes the line that seals it. Not one of all the Lord's good promises failed. Not one. Not delayed forever. Not forgotten. Not broken. Fulfilled. Joshua had lived to see it. He had entered the land as a soldier, led as a commander, finished as a shepherd of a nation. Only after everyone else received their inheritance did Joshua accept his own. Timnath-Serah, a quiet town in the hill country of Ephraim. No great walls, no grand reputation, but it was enough. Joshua rebuilt it, settled there, and watched the nation move forward. Yet Joshua knew something deeply important. Promises fulfilled do not guarantee faith continued. He had seen that lesson before. An entire generation had witnessed miracles in Egypt and still turned away. So Joshua gathered Israel one last time, not for celebration, for warning. Standing before elders, leaders, judges, and officials, Joshua spoke plainly. I am very old. There was no denial, no attempt to soften reality. Then he reminded them of what mattered. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done. Not Moses, not Joshua, the Lord. Victory had never been human achievement. It had always been divine faithfulness. Then Joshua gave a command that sounded almost like a plea. Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. He warned them about compromise, about alliances with the nations still living among them, about borrowed gods, borrowed practices, borrowed loyalties. Joshua's words carried weight because they came from experience. He knew how easily faith erodes when fear disappears. He told them the truth they did not want to hear. Just as God had kept every promise of blessing, he would also keep every warning of judgment. The same God who gave them rest could remove it. Later Joshua gathered them again, this time at Shechem, a place heavy with memory. Here God had first promised the land to Abraham. Here covenants had been made before. Joshua retold their entire story, from Abraham's calling, to Egypt's chains, to the wilderness years, to the conquest of Canaan. Then he placed the decision squarely before them. Fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Then came the line that would define Joshua forever. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Joshua did not force them, did not manipulate emotion. He respected their freedom, and then he declared his own. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. The people responded passionately. We will serve the Lord, Joshua warned them again. God was holy. God was jealous. This covenant was serious. Still, they insisted. So Joshua made a covenant with them that day. He wrote the words in the book of the law. He set up a large stone as a witness. This stone has heard everything, Joshua said. It will testify against you if you turn away. Then he sent everyone home, to their land, to their inheritance, to their responsibility. Shortly after Joshua died, 110 years old, he was buried in the land God had given him. And Scripture adds one final, sobering line. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him. Faith lasted as long as the witnesses remained. The question hung in the air. What happens when the witnesses are gone? Because promises fulfilled are only powerful if remembered, and faith that is not passed on does not survive. The story was not over, but a chapter had closed, and the next generation was about to be tested. Joshua was gone. Caleb was gone. The voices that had seen the Red Sea split, the Jordan stop, the walls of Jericho, fall slowly fell silent. And with them, something else began to fade. Memory. Scripture makes a quiet but chilling transition. As long as the elders who had experienced everything the Lord had done remained alive, Israel served the Lord. Those words reveal a fragile truth. Faith was standing on borrowed memory. The next generation inherited the land but not the experience. They lived in houses they did not build. They drank from wells they did not dig. They enjoyed peace they did not fight for. To them, Canaan was normal. Milk and honey were expected. Rest was assumed. Blessing felt automatic. And that is always the most dangerous moment, because faith that is not personally owned eventually becomes optional. The miracles were now stories told by grandparents. The covenant was something written on stone. The God who once thundered from Sinai now felt distant. Slowly, subtly, compromise crept in. They lived among the nations God had commanded them to drive out. They learned their customs, listened to their stories, respected their gods. At first, nothing dramatic happened. They still spoke the Lord's name, still gathered at times, still remembered Joshua's words. But they also allowed something else, a divided heart. They did not reject God outright. They simply added others beside him. And that is how faith dies quietly, not through rebellion but through dilution. The book of Judges opens with a sobering assessment. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. They knew the land. They did not know the Lord. They knew prosperity. They did not know dependence. And the result was predictable. They did what was right in their own eyes, without a Joshua, without a Caleb, without witnesses. The cycle began. God's people drifted. Enemies oppressed them. They cried out. God raised a deliverer. Again and again, the contrast is striking. One generation waited 40 years and trusted God enough to step into giants. Another generation received everything and slowly walked away. The difference was not intelligence, not opportunity, not resources. It was remembrance. Joshua had understood this danger. That is why he set stones in the Jordan. That is why he renewed the covenant. That is why he forced a decision. Choose this day. Because faith cannot be inherited, it must be chosen. Every generation stands at its own Jordan. Not always a river, sometimes a culture, sometimes comfort, sometimes success. And the question remains the same. Will you serve the Lord because your parents did, or because you have chosen him yourself? Joshua chose before the land was secure. Caleb chose before the giants fell. They believed when belief was costly. Later generations enjoyed the results without embracing the cost. And slowly courage disappeared. The story is not ancient history. It is a mirror. Many today live surrounded by blessings paid for by someone else's faith. Churches built by prayer. Freedom purchased by sacrifice. Truth preserved by conviction. But comfort makes us forget what fear once taught. We stop telling the stories. Stop setting the stones. Stop choosing deliberately until faith becomes background noise. The Bible does not end Joshua's story with conquest. It ends with a warning. Promises fulfilled do not eliminate responsibility. They increase it. Because the greatest test of faith is not when you have nothing. It is when you have everything. Joshua crossed the Jordan, trusting God for the impossible. The next generation crossed nothing and slowly lost sight of him. And that leads us to a personal question. What happens when your faith is no longer tested by crisis? When prayer is optional? When obedience costs little? When compromise feels harmless? Who will you serve then? Because God is still faithful, still powerful, still patient, but he will not force loyalty. The land was given, the choice remained, and it still does. Every generation reaches a moment where faith stops being inherited and starts demanding a decision. Not everyone stands before a raging river. Not everyone faces giants or fortified walls. But everyone faces a Jordan, a line between what is familiar and what requires trust. For Joshua's generation, the Jordan was literal, flooded, uncrossable, impossible without God. For the next generation, the Jordan was invisible, comfort, routine, assimilation. And that kind of river is far more dangerous because it does not look threatening. Joshua had crossed his Jordan when Moses was still alive. He chose faith when leadership was uncertain, when outcomes were unknown, when fear was loud. Caleb crossed his Jordan when 10 voices screamed impossible and only 2 whispered God is able. They crossed before seeing victory. Later generations stood on the other side without remembering the crossing. They enjoyed safety without remembering surrender. And that is where faith weakens. When obedience is no longer urgent, when trust is no longer necessary, when God becomes an option, not a lifeline. Scripture never hides this pattern. Blessing leads to comfort, comfort leads to forgetfulness. Forgetfulness leads to compromise, and compromise always leads to loss. Not loss of land first, loss of identity. Israel did not immediately lose territory. They lost distinction. They looked like the nations around them, thought like them, worshipped like them. They still used God's name, but they no longer lived by his voice. Joshua had warned them, do not cling to these nations. Do not serve their gods. Hold fast to the Lord. Those words were not fear-driven. They were experience-driven. Joshua had watched an entire generation die in the wilderness, not because God was unfaithful, but because they refused to trust him. He knew how quickly fear returns when faith is not renewed. That is why Joshua did not ask Israel what they believed. He asked whom they would serve. Belief can be passive. Service is active. Belief can exist in memory. Service demands action. And service always costs something. For some, it costs reputation. For others, comfort. For others, control. But it always costs self-rule. That is the part every generation resists. The next generation wanted God's protection without God's authority. God's blessing without God's boundaries. God's promises without God's presence. And that combination never works. The book of Judges proves it. When Israel served the Lord, there was peace. When they served themselves, there was chaos. Enemies rose. Oppression followed. Crying out returned. Again and again. God remained faithful, but the people remained unstable because faith was reactive, not rooted. They turned to God in pain, not in prosperity. And that raises a hard question for every viewer today. Is your faith strongest when life is hardest or when life is easiest? Because the true test of devotion is not desperation, it is abundance. Joshua's final challenge was not shouted in battle, it was spoken in peace. Choose this day. Choose when no one is forcing you. Choose when consequences feel distant. Choose when compromise looks harmless. That choice is still being asked, not by a prophet on a mountain, but by daily decisions. What shapes your values? What defines your priorities? What commands your loyalty? Because every heart serves something: comfort, success, approval, control, or the Lord. Joshua did not promise Israel that serving God would be easy. He promised it would be faithful. Caleb did not claim Hebron because it was safe. He claimed it because God was there. And the same God who parted the Jordan still asks the same question. Not what did your parents believe, not what culture accepts, but whom will you serve, because the land can be inherited. Faith cannot, and every generation must cross its own Jordan. At some point, every great story turns toward the listener. Not loudly, not abruptly, but inevitably. Joshua's story does not end with conquest. It ends with a mirror, because the real question was never whether Israel could take the land. The question was what they would do once they had it. They had crossed the Jordan. They had seen miracles. They had watched walls fall and giants flee. But now, there were no trumpets blowing, no rivers parting, no visible signs demanding belief. Only ordinary days, fields to tend, homes to maintain, children to raise, choices to make. And that is where faith is either formed or quietly lost. Joshua understood something many never realize. Miracles can introduce faith, but they cannot sustain it. Only choice can. That is why his final words were not instructions for battle, but a call to decision. Choose for yourselves this day, not yesterday, not someday, this day. Because faith delayed is faith denied. The people answered confidently, "We will serve the Lord." And for a time, they meant it. As long as Joshua lived, as long as the elders who remembered lived, Israel stayed faithful. But memory fades faster than we expect. The next generation did not wake up deciding to abandon God. They simply woke up deciding other things mattered more. Comfort, security, acceptance. Their lives were full, but their devotion was thin. And here is where the story turns toward us. Most people do not reject God in crisis. They drift from Him in comfort. When prayers are no longer desperate, when obedience no longer feels urgent, when faith becomes tradition instead of trust. That is when the Jordan reappears, not as a river of danger, but as a river of distraction. On one side, a faith that requires intention. On the other, a life that feels easier without resistance. Crossing that Jordan does not feel heroic. It feels inconvenient because it means choosing God when no one is watching, choosing truth when compromise is easier, choosing obedience when disobedience carries no immediate cost. Joshua crossed his Jordan before the land was secure. Caleb crossed his before the giants were gone. They believed God before seeing results. Later generations wanted results without belief, and that never works. The Bible is honest about this. Faith that depends on evidence will always weaken when evidence fades. But faith that depends on God's character endures when circumstances change. That is why Joshua never said, "Remember the miracles." He said, "Serve the Lord." Service is active, daily, intentional. It requires choosing again and again and again. And that is the question now facing the viewer. Not, do you believe God exists? Many do. But belief alone never built an altar, never crossed a river, never defeated a giant. The question is deeper. Who do you serve when faith costs you something? Who shapes your decisions when no miracle is on display? Who holds your loyalty when culture pulls the other direction? Because something always does. Joshua did not pretend neutrality was possible. He knew every heart serves something. If not God, then comfort. If not truth, then approval. If not obedience, then self. And every choice shapes a legacy. One generation wandered for 40 years because fear ruled their decisions. 2 men waited patiently because faith ruled theirs. The difference was not timing, it was trust. And now the story has reached its quiet moment. No battle scene, no dramatic miracle. Just a choice. The same one Joshua set before Israel. Not forced, not manipulated, chosen. The land had been given, but faith still had to be claimed. And that is where this story stops being history and becomes personal. Because the question has never changed. Not for Israel, not for Joshua, not for you. Choose this day whom you will serve. And whatever you choose will shape everything that follows. Every choice has a cost. Some costs are immediate, others are delayed. But none are free. Joshua understood this when he stood before Israel and challenged them to choose whom they would serve. He did not offer comfort. He did not promise ease. He warned them. God is holy, he said. He is jealous. Those words were not meant to frighten them. They were meant to clarify reality. Serving the Lord was never casual. It was covenant, a binding relationship that shaped behavior, loyalty, and identity. And Joshua knew something painful. Most people do not struggle with belief. They struggle with consistency. Belief can be held privately. Consistency must be lived publicly. Caleb understood this too. When he asked for Hebron, he was not claiming a reward. He was accepting responsibility. Hebron still had giants, fortified cities, real danger. Caleb's faith did not remove opposition. It directed him through it. That is the price of trust. God does not promise the absence of difficulty. He promises his presence within it. Joshua had paid his price early. He followed Moses through rebellion and disappointment. He waited 40 years while others died around him. He led battles that demanded absolute dependence on God. And in the end, he accepted his inheritance last. Leadership cost him comfort. Faith cost him time. Caleb paid differently. He waited decades for a promise that never expired. He endured the silence of delay, the frustration of watching unbelief bury an entire generation. But when the time came, his strength had not faded. Faith had preserved him. Now contrast that with the generation that followed. They paid a different price. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. They compromised. They blended. They chose convenience over conviction. And slowly freedom was replaced by oppression. Enemies they could have driven out now ruled over them. God still rescued them, again and again. But rescue is not the same as rest. They lived in cycles because they refused consistency. The price of compromise was instability. The price of obedience was endurance. And that truth remains uncomfortable. Because we often assume that faith should make life easier. Joshua and Caleb knew better. Faith makes life purposeful, not painless. It aligns you with God's will, not personal comfort. And alignment always demands surrender. That is why many hesitate. Because surrender feels like loss. Loss of control, loss of autonomy, loss of options. But what Joshua saw and what Caleb lived was something deeper. Surrender does not shrink life, it anchors it. A life built on convenience shifts with every pressure. A life built on conviction stands when storms arrive. That is why God allowed Israel to face remaining enemies. Not as punishment, as training. Each tribe had to fight for the land assigned to them. Inheritance was given. Possession required effort, and effort revealed faith. Some tribes pressed forward, others settled for partial victory. And partial victory always leads to partial obedience. The story forces a question we often avoid. What is your faith costing you? If it costs nothing, it may be worth nothing. If it never challenges comfort, it may never change character. Joshua's faith cost him popularity. Caleb's faith cost him waiting. But compromise cost Israel peace. And peace lost is far more expensive than obedience ever was. So when Joshua said, "Choose this day," he was not inviting preference. He was presenting consequence. Serve the Lord and walk in alignment with his promises. Or serve something else and bear the weight of that choice. No one escapes the cost. The only question is, which cost you are willing to carry. Because every Jordan cross demands something left behind. And what you refuse to release will eventually rule you. One of the hardest truths in Scripture is not that God makes promises. It is that not everyone walks into them. The promise of the land was given to all Israel, but only a generation later did most of them die outside its borders. Not because God failed, but because fear spoke louder than faith. Joshua and Caleb were living proof that belief alone was never the issue. They all saw the same miracles. They all walked through the same sea. They all ate the same manna. Yet only 2 men carried the promise in their hearts long enough to step into it. That tells us something uncomfortable. Exposure to God is not the same as trusting God. Being near the promise does not guarantee possession of it. The wilderness generation heard God's voice, but they never learned to rely on his character. Every obstacle became evidence of abandonment. Every delay felt like rejection. They interpreted difficulty as proof that God had misled them. Joshua and Caleb interpreted difficulty as proof that the promise mattered. That difference changed everything. When the spies returned from Canaan, the facts were not disputed. The land was fertile, the cities were fortified, the giants were real. But facts do not control destiny. Interpretation does. 10 spies interpreted obstacles as reasons to retreat. 2 interpreted them as confirmation that God was faithful enough to overcome them. And that moment sealed 40 years of wandering. Not because God changed his mind, but because the people refused to change theirs. Promises do not expire. People do. Faith that is not exercised atrophies. Joshua watched an entire generation talk themselves out of what God had already decided to give them. And the most tragic part was not the loss of land. It was the loss of time. Years wasted walking in circles. Lives defined by delay instead of destiny. Caleb felt that loss deeply. Every year that passed was another year closer to death, another year without fulfillment. Yet he never loosened his grip on the promise. Not because he was stubborn, but because he was anchored. He did not need constant reassurance. He remembered who God was when fear tried to rewrite the story. That is why decades later he could say with confidence, "I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me." Strength like that is not physical. It is forged. Forged in waiting. Forged in disappointment. Forged in choosing faith when obedience seems unrewarded. Joshua understood this too. Leadership meant carrying hope when others lost it. It meant trusting God when the outcome was delayed. It meant believing that faithfulness was never wasted even when it was unseen. And this is where the story quietly confronts the modern listener. Many people love the idea of God's promises, but few are prepared for the process. We want arrival without endurance. We want fulfillment without formation. But God rarely delivers promises without reshaping the person who receives them. Because a promise entered too early can destroy the one who carries it. That is why delay is not denial. It is preparation. The wilderness was not a mistake. It was a test. Not of God's power, but of Israel's trust. Joshua and Caleb passed the test long before the land was ever claimed. That is why they survived long enough to see it. Others wanted the promise without the trust. And trust cannot be borrowed. It cannot be inherited. It must be chosen. Daily. Quietly. Often without applause. That is why Scripture is honest about unfinished stories. Not everyone who starts the journey finishes it. Not everyone who hears the call answers it. Not everyone who believes endures. And yet the promise remains. Still waiting, still available, but it demands something many resist. Faith that outlasts delay. Obedience that survives disappointment. Trust that does not collapse when circumstances contradict hope. Joshua crossed into the land because he trusted God in the wilderness. Caleb claimed his mountain because he refused to let time erode his belief. They did not enter the promise because they were stronger. They entered because they stayed faithful longer. And that is the line that separates those who wander from those who arrive. There is a quiet force shaping every life, stronger than talent, louder than fear, and more persistent than circumstance. And that force is memory. Not memory as nostalgia, but memory as interpretation, the story you tell yourself about who God has been, and therefore who he must still be. Joshua knew this. That is why before he ever spoke about choice, obedience, or loyalty, he constantly brought the people back to remembrance. Remember how the Lord your God brought you out. Not because God needed credit, but because people forget faster than they fall. The collapse of faith rarely begins with rebellion. It begins with selective memory. Israel did not suddenly decide that God was unfaithful. They simply remembered Egypt's food more clearly than Egypt's chains. They remembered the comfort but forgot the cruelty. And memory reshaped desire. Joshua and Caleb remembered differently. They remembered fear, yes, but they remembered faithfulness more. They remembered the Red Sea not as a risk, but as a revelation. They remembered manna, not as monotony, but as mercy. They remembered failure, not as proof of abandonment, but as evidence of patience. That difference was everything. Because when pressure comes, you do not rise to the level of your faith. You fall to the level of your memory. If your memory of God is shallow, your trust will be fragile. If your memory of God is selective, your obedience will be conditional. But if your memory is anchored in truth, your faith can survive silence, delay, and uncertainty. This is why Scripture is filled with altars, stones, feasts, and songs. Not to decorate history, but to preserve perspective. God knew his people would forget. He knew that time dulls gratitude and comfort erodes dependence. So he commanded remembrance. Tell your children, write it down, mark the moment. Because unremembered faith is easily replaced by fear. Joshua understood the danger of a generation that knows the stories, but not the God behind them. He watched it happen. After his death, the Bible records a haunting sentence. There arose another generation who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Not because the stories disappeared, but because memory was no longer personal. It became inherited information instead of lived conviction. That is when faith weakens. When God becomes an idea instead of a reference point, Caleb avoided that trap. Decades after the promise was given, he could still say, "The Lord has kept me alive. Not I survived, not I endured, but the Lord has kept me." His memory was relational. He did not remember events alone. He remembered presence. And presence changes interpretation. The same desert that broke others became proof of preservation for him. The same delay that produced bitterness in many produced confidence in him. Because memory, when shaped by trust, turns waiting into witness. This is where the story presses closer to the viewer. What do you remember most clearly when life becomes difficult? The unanswered prayers or the unexpected rescues, the delays or the deliverances, the silence or the sustaining grace, because what you rehearse internally will eventually govern you externally. If you constantly remember loss, you will live guarded. If you constantly remember disappointment, you will expect less. But if you remember God's faithfulness, even imperfectly, your faith gains resilience. Joshua did not deny Israel's failures. He framed them. He reminded them that God's patience outlasted their rebellion, that grace had not run out when they deserved it to. That mercy carried them, even when obedience lagged behind. That memory gave them a choice. Not a naive one, an informed one. Serve the Lord, not because you are strong, but because He has been faithful. And that is the kind of memory that sustains obedience when feelings fade. Because feelings are unreliable witnesses. Memory anchored in truth is far more stable. Joshua knew he would not live forever. But if memory survived, faith could too. And that is why the story refuses to stay in the past. Because every generation stands one forgotten truth away from collapse and one remembered truth away from renewal. What you remember about God will decide how you interpret suffering, how you respond to delay, and whether you continue walking when the promise feels distant. Memory does not change the situation. It changes the soul standing inside it. And that is why Joshua's legacy was not land. It was remembrance. A people reminded that God had never failed them. And that reminder was meant to carry them long after His voice fell silent. The most painful losses do not happen in a single moment. They happen quietly. Joshua's legacy did not collapse overnight. It faded. After his death, there was no immediate rebellion, no dramatic turning away. Life simply continued. Homes were built. Children were raised. And somewhere in the ordinary rhythm of success, devotion loosened its grip. The Bible does not say the next generation rejected God. It says they did not know Him. That distinction matters. Ignorance here was not the absence of information. It was the absence of relationship. They knew the stories, they knew the names, they knew the rituals, but they did not know the Lord in a way that shaped obedience. And that is how legacy fades. Not through hatred, but through neglect. Joshua had drawn the line clearly. Serve the Lord or serve something else. But the next generation blurred it. They attempted mixture. God alongside comfort. Worship alongside convenience. Covenant alongside culture. And divided devotion always leads to diluted faith. They tolerated what should have been confronted. They coexisted with influences that slowly reshaped their values. And compromise, when normalized, no longer feels like compromise. It feels like balance. This is why the decline felt subtle. There was no immediate collapse, just gradual erosion. The God who once led them became a resource instead of a ruler. Called upon in crisis, ignored in prosperity. And when difficulty returned, they were unprepared. Because faith that is not practiced does not activate under pressure. The book of Judges captures this pattern relentlessly. God delivers. The people respond. Peace follows. Then complacency. Then compromise. Then oppression. Then desperation. Then God delivers again. Not because they were faithful, but because He was merciful. Yet mercy does not eliminate consequence. Each cycle left the nation weaker, more divided, more confused, more vulnerable. The tragedy was not that God withdrew. It was that the people forgot how to remain close. Joshua's generation had fought giants. The next generation negotiated with them. What one generation confronts, the next tolerates. What one generation resists, the next rationalizes. And what is rationalized eventually rules. That is the cost of an unguarded legacy. Caleb's example stands in sharp contrast. His faith did not fade because it was active until the end. He did not assume others would carry it forward. He lived it visibly. And visible faith leaves an imprint. But even strong examples cannot override widespread neglect. Faith cannot be preserved by admiration alone. It requires participation. The next generation admired Joshua. They just did not imitate him. And admiration without imitation is admiration without impact. This is where the story confronts a sobering reality. Spiritual decline rarely announces itself. It blends in. It adopts familiar language. It keeps the appearance of devotion. But beneath the surface, loyalty shifts. Obedience becomes optional. Truth becomes flexible. And soon faith becomes reactive instead of formative. Joshua warned them. Not because he lacked optimism, but because he understood human nature. Success breeds forgetfulness faster than suffering ever does. When survival is no longer threatened, dependence weakens. And dependence is the backbone of faith. This is why legacy must be guarded, not assumed. It must be reinforced, not remembered casually. The fading of Joshua's legacy was not inevitable. It was preventable. But prevention requires vigilance, and vigilance is uncomfortable. It requires confronting compromise before it feels dangerous. It requires choosing faithfulness when unfaithfulness seems harmless. It requires remembering what God has done before. Forgetting becomes convenient. The story of Israel after Joshua is not just historical, it is diagnostic. It shows what happens when faith is treated as inheritance instead of commitment. And it raises a question that refuses to stay silent. If legacy can fade this easily, what protects it? The answer is not control, it is devotion. Not occasional, not inherited, daily, visible, chosen. Because faith that is not renewed will be replaced, and whatever replaces it will not be neutral. If the story ended with failure, it would be unbearable. But Scripture never tells stories that way. Even in the darkest cycles of Israel's history, there is a quiet, persistent truth that refuses to disappear. God does not abandon his people when they forget him. He pursues them, again and again. The book of Judges is painful to read not because God is absent, but because he is present and ignored. Each time Israel fell into oppression, it was not God turning away. It was the consequence of misplaced trust. And yet when they cried out, he responded. Not immediately, always, not without cost, but faithfully. This is where hope survives. Not in human consistency, but in divine patience. The judges were not perfect heroes. They were flawed deliverers. Men and women raised up not because Israel deserved rescue, but because God refused to let the story end in ruin. That tells us something essential. God's commitment to his purposes outlasts human failure. Joshua's legacy may have faded, but God's promise did not. Caleb's faith may have been rare, but God honored it. And when faith seemed scarce, God supplied leaders who pointed the people back toward dependence. The cycles of judges were tragic, but they were also merciful. Each collapse revealed how desperately the people needed God. Each rescue reminded them that he had not changed. The land was still theirs. The promise still stood, but peace required alignment, not perfection. Alignment. This is a critical distinction. God was not waiting for flawless obedience. He was waiting for returning hearts. And returning requires humility. It requires recognizing that compromise has consequences, that self-rule leads to instability, that freedom without direction becomes chaos. Judges closes with a haunting summary. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This was not freedom. It was fragmentation. And yet even here, hope was being prepared. Because the failure of self-rule creates hunger for righteous leadership, God was teaching his people what they truly needed. Not stronger armies, not stricter laws. A heart aligned with him. The story was moving forward even when it seemed stuck. God was not improvising. He was unfolding redemption layer by layer. Joshua's generation showed what faith could do. The generation after showed what happens without it. And God in his patience used both to teach humanity that salvation does not come through human strength, it comes through surrender. This hope matters because it reframes failure. Failure does not disqualify. It reveals dependence. When Israel cried out, God answered, not because they were worthy, but because he is faithful. That is the heartbeat of Scripture, and that heartbeat carries forward, beyond Joshua, beyond the judges, beyond the failures, towards something greater. The story was not finished. It was being prepared. Each flawed deliverer pointed toward the need for a perfect one. Each temporary rescue created longing for permanent redemption. Joshua led the people into the land, but he could not change their hearts. Caleb modeled faithfulness, but he could not reproduce it universally. The judges restored order temporarily, but the cycles continued. Something more was needed. Someone more. And this is where hope deepens. Because God's answer to fading legacy was not abandonment, it was incarnation. The story was moving toward a leader who would not just command obedience, but transform hearts. A deliverer who would not merely defeat enemies, but conquer sin. A king whose reign would not depend on human loyalty, but on divine faithfulness. The failures of Israel were not the end. They were the evidence. Evidence that humanity needs more than instruction, more than example. We need transformation. And God was already at work long before the people realized it. Hope survived the collapse because God never withdrew his promise. Even when faith flickered, his purpose burned steadily. And that is why the story continues. Not despite failure, but through it. Every story in Scripture, no matter how wide it stretches across centuries, eventually narrows to a single moment of decision. And this story is no different. Because beneath the victories of Joshua, the endurance of Caleb, the failures of B12, Israel, and the patience of God, there lies one unchanging truth. Every generation must choose for itself who will rule its heart. Joshua understood this when he stood at the end of his life and refused to soften his words, because he knew that faith cannot survive on borrowed conviction, and obedience cannot be sustained by inherited belief. The land had been conquered, the enemies subdued, and the promise fulfilled in visible ways. Yet the most dangerous moment had arrived, not in battle, but in peace, when the urgency of dependence began to fade, and the temptation to live casually before God grew strong. That is why Joshua's final challenge still echoes with uncomfortable clarity. He did not ask whether the people admired God, spoke about God, or believed stories about God. He asked whom they would serve. Because service reveals allegiance, and allegiance shapes destiny. Caleb's life answers that question without words. Decades of waiting did not dilute his trust. Time did not weaken his obedience. Delay did not erode his confidence. He chose faith not once, but repeatedly, quietly when no one was applauding and no outcome was guaranteed. His choice was not dramatic. It was durable. And durability is what carries faith across generations. Israel, however, showed what happens when choice is postponed. When devotion becomes optional, faith slowly shifts from the center to the margins where it remains available but no longer authoritative. God becomes someone to consult rather than someone to obey, someone to thank rather than someone to trust, and eventually someone to remember rather than someone to follow. The cycles that followed Joshua were not accidents of history. They were the natural result of unchosen faith. Because faith that is not chosen will eventually be replaced by something that is. There is no neutral ground. Every heart serves something, whether comfort, approval, security, or self, and whatever occupies that highest place will shape decisions, values, and identity. This is why the story refuses to stay ancient. It presses into the present with unsettling relevance. We live in a time filled with access to information about God, yet often lacking intimacy with Him. We know the language of belief, but struggle with the discipline of obedience. We admire faith but hesitate to practice it when it costs us convenience, control, or certainty. Joshua's words cut through that hesitation. Choose this day, not when circumstances improve, not when clarity increases, not when obedience feels easier. Choose now. Because waiting to choose is already a choice and it rarely leads toward faithfulness. The tragedy of Israel was not ignorance. It was delay. They knew enough to obey, but waited for conditions that never came. And in that waiting compromise crept in quietly reshaping priorities until faith no longer governed life but merely decorated it. Caleb chose differently. He did not wait for consensus. He did not wait for comfort. He did not wait for perfect conditions. He trusted the character of God more than the stability of circumstances, and that trust shaped a life that finished as faithfully as it began. This is the dividing line that runs through every generation, not between belief and unbelief, but between chosen faith and neglected faith, between devotion that shapes life and devotion that exists only in words, between trust that endures delay and trust that collapses under pressure. God's faithfulness has never been the variable. Human response has always been. The promise still stands. The invitation remains open. The land in every sense is still before us. But entry requires more than agreement. It requires surrender. Joshua knew his time was ending, but the decision would continue. Caleb knew his strength was fading, but his faith would speak beyond him. God knew that humanity would struggle again and again, but he also knew that every generation would still be offered the same choice. Not forced, not manipulated, offered. Serve the Lord and walk in alignment with his purpose, even when it costs you. Or serve something else and bear the weight of that allegiance, even when it promises ease. The story does not tell us which choice every generation will make. It tells us only that the choice cannot be avoided, and whatever is chosen will shape everything that follows. Because faith is never proven by how it begins. It is revealed by how it endures. Every great story reaches a point where the narrator steps back, and the listener is quietly left alone with a question that cannot be ignored. This is that moment. The land has been taken. The promises have been fulfilled. The leaders have finished their race. And now the story turns its gaze toward us, not to inform us, but to confront us. Joshua's life ended without spectacle. No final battle, no dramatic miracle, just a burial in the land he had waited his entire life to enter. The Bible does not record his final emotions, but it records his legacy. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and the elders who outlived him, those who had seen with their own eyes what God had done. Faith endured as long as memory remained vivid. And therein lies the warning hidden inside the victory. Faith that survives only on memory will fade when witnesses disappear. Faith that depends on past miracles will weaken when new challenges arise. Faith that is inherited but never chosen will eventually be abandoned. The generation that crossed the Jordan believed because they had seen. The generation that followed would be tested because they had only heard. Caleb's story quietly reinforces this truth. His strength was never the miracle. His faithfulness was. He did not rely on nostalgia. He did not rehearse what God had done while refusing to trust what God would do. He lived forward, not backward. Even at 85, he was still moving toward promise, not resting on history. Joshua and Caleb remind us that faith is not proven in moments of arrival, but in seasons of waiting. Not in victories that impress others, but in obedience that persists when no one is watching. Not in beginnings fueled by excitement, but in endings shaped by endurance. The tragedy that followed Joshua's generation did not begin with rebellion. It began with neglect, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Altars were left unmaintained. Teachings were no longer repeated. Choices were delayed. And in the absence of intentional devotion, other voices filled the space. This is how stories unravel. Not through sudden collapse, but through gradual distraction. And this is why the story of Joshua never truly ends. Because it is not only a record of conquest, it is a mirror. It asks whether we are living on borrowed faith or chosen faith, whether we are guided by conviction or convenience, whether we are content to admire courage or willing to practice it. God's promises did not fail Israel. Not one word fell to the ground. The question was never whether God would remain faithful. The question was whether the people would remain faithful when faith was no longer urgent. That question still stands. We live on the other side of countless testimonies surrounded by access to scripture teaching and history that previous generations could only imagine. And yet, access does not equal obedience. Knowledge does not guarantee trust. Familiarity does not produce surrender. Joshua did not ask Israel to feel strongly. He asked them to choose deliberately, because choice precedes character, and character determines direction. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Those words were not poetry. They were commitment. They did not promise ease. They declared allegiance. Joshua was not saying life would be safe. He was saying it would be faithful. And faithfulness more than success is what God has always desired. The Jordan still lies before every generation in different forms. Fear, uncertainty, delay, opposition. The waters still rise, the walls still loom, the giants still intimidate, and the question remains unchanged. Will you step forward trusting God's presence, or remain on the edge waiting for certainty that never comes? Joshua crossed. Caleb waited and endured. Moses trusted even when he could only see from a distance. None of them lived perfectly. All of them trusted deeply. And God honored that trust across decades, deserts, and generations. Now the story pauses not because it is finished, but because it is being handed off to you. If this story stirred something inside you, it is not accidental. It is an invitation to choose faith, not as a concept, but as a direction. To trust God not only with outcomes, but with obedience. To believe that waiting is not wasted, courage is not forgotten, and promises are not delayed without purpose. Because the same God who led Israel still leads today, the same God who kept his word still keeps his word. And the same question Joshua asked still demands an answer. Choose this day. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Today. Because when God's story becomes your story, faith stops being history and starts becoming destiny. And that choice will echo far longer than you imagine.